thank you everyone for the patience. I don't want to kiss and tell, but Daniel told me that he does this every time on purpose so that people wait for him. The reason we kind of thought of bringing you two here tonight together is actually a third artist who's not with us this evening, an LA-based artist named Joe Ray that I think many of you know, certainly after the two latest exhibitions we ran at the gallery, first in London in October across Frieze Masters and the gallery, and later here in what remains an iteration of that second exhibition, which was called Observatory at the end of last year. But Joe Ray is someone I'd like to say a few words about, because he's really the glue that made us think about this topic of conversation tonight that's called making space. And Joe works for the past 60 years, I think, around that single, very, very broad and focused subject of space. For him, space is a real human problem. It is also the ultimate human condition, and human potential of existence revolves around that notion, around that concept. And he began his career in a kind of strange way as, at first, an artist who did not have much training and came from Alexandria, Louisiana, and arrived in Los Angeles in 1963, discovered a lot of what he learned about, about art by working initially as a frame maker and as an art technician, and then a studio assistant for artists like particularly Larry Bell, and very, very involved with a group of artists many of you would know as the Southern California Light and Space movement, but also involved with another group of artists who in a way sat across the street but were not in the same conversation, including artists like David Hammond, Senga Ngudi, people who were thinking about a very different set of political questions. But Joe Ray felt, in a way, that he found this very unusual term, or this very unusual notion of space, as something that brought in him kind of an opportunity to speak of his identity in an amazing way. He initially started by working in very, very humble means. So his first works, which sadly we no longer can show, we've had them on loan for a period here, are resin, small, what he would call at the time pills, but they're actually universes, these resin little capsules that he would hold in hand for weeks, polishing and creating as kind of universes that are as grand as he could imagine them, but also something he could always carry and he could always produce with very, very meager and simple means. And gradually, with the years from the 60s onwards, he developed what we see mostly in that section of the group exhibition we've had here in the space, which are those nebula paintings. And the concept of a nebula, Joe started speaking when we were working on this exhibition and explaining that nebulas always fascinated him because they were, the most violent phenomena you can imagine. When you imagine a nebula as the kind of breaking and also formation of star constellations or stars is at once a very beautiful thing and also a very dramatic and disastrous and violent experience, and a very colorful one. And he thought, space continues to say space holds color, space holds our relationship to one another. And so with this really harsh metaphor of his career, which he always struggles with, he says, about a work that's very, very beautiful, as you can see on the one hand, but bears a lot of questions about, where does one position, where does a Black American artist positions himself in 1965 in Los Angeles, etc. And I think one of the nicest things that he wanted to show in this exhibition, when we said it will be really about the concept of making space, is a group of what he calls columns, and you can see them in the next room. There are these, these tall corner pieces that he would sculpt with his hands But he said they really came out of the problem that I felt that there was no space for me on the wall. But he said, nobody makes art for the corners. Why don't I start making space for the corner, works for the corners? And it's that humor, but it's also there's a very potent saying about, how do you create color and put it in the corners? How do you occupy that with, a really majestic, futuristic, fantastic entities that feel to embody all of these fantasies he had and conversations he had at the time about notions of, Afrofuturism and potential fantastical other abilities to exist and create art in the space. So thanks to Joe, we're all sitting here, and I know that he's very pleased we're all sitting here and talking partly about his work. When we started, his show developed this show that then came after here and was a more of a broader historical view on artists looking at space throughout history. And really, when we started thinking about how do we put words on this subject today, it was very easy to get to the both of you for the reasons I just mentioned here, but particularly that sincere and deep preoccupation with space and the idea of making space. And then I sat down and made a very, very long introduction to both of you and realized you have between you more awards, fellowships, grants, solo exhibitions, buildings than would anybody here need to sit and listen to. But by a better way of introduction, I know you both also have very good kind of initiation stories, different ones I know, but we've spoken about a couple that maybe you can start by sharing a bit about that first encounter that you've each had with your artistic practice, with your creative practice. Maybe that will be a more interesting introduction for today's audience. And Sanford, maybe you wouldn't mind starting.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a very exciting conversation. This is a subject matter that I'm very interested in, and it is fun to start from this point of my life, when I was growing up in Los Angeles in the 70s. And the classes that I enjoyed the most in school were basically my art classes. Lots of refrigerator art, lots of finger painting, lots of macaroni collages. But hip hop, it wasn't even hip hop, rap started. And that hit Los Angeles. You guys had it in New York before we did, but it got to LA probably around 79. And the Wild Style film got to LA around 1981 or 82. I was in junior high school with two of my friends, and we were big music heads, but the hip hop thing had not happened yet. Rapper's Delight happened in 79. Then Curtis Blow, another very important New York rapper who later became a DJ, moved into my neighborhood from New York to start a radio position. So now we had an influx of a little bit more East Coast rap. And then there was one record store in all of LA that would sell rap albums and rap singles that they would get imported from New York and just the East Coast in general. So when that happened and we saw Wild Style, my dad had to take me and my friends, because we were too young to see this on our own. It was at one art house cinema on Melrose Avenue, and we went there, and we all came out with fat shoelaces and doing graffiti in little books and, rapping and breakdancing, right? It was like, okay, this is a culture. This is a thing happening right now. So I started doing graffiti. So I, adopted at least 3 of the hip hop arts. I did graffiti, I did breakdancing, and DJing. So graffiti, this time I was around junior high school, we started in notebooks and just doing what they call burners or little pieces. And then later we used to sneak out of our house and take spray paint and literally do graffiti on the streets of LA. Then I got busted around 15. Luckily, I didn't go to jail, but I've got the fear of God, basically. And my parents, later I went to school and they put me into AP painting classes. So I started to do oil paintings. And that was an interesting moment as well. We had an assignment once from one of the instructors who I loved dearly. And she was like, everybody go home. I want you to do portraits and sketches of people in your family, your friends, people who come over to your house. So we all did this thing, right? And then, a week later, we come back with all of our work. And the teacher sort of held my work up and said, why is everybody black? I was like, wasn't the assignment just to take, do sketches of our family and people who were coming around? Why is that even noticeable? There's a bunch of people, So I realized at that point that on some level, race was inextricable from what I was doing just by nature of the viewer. not by my intent. So that taught me a very important lesson as a teen. And other lessons have come up that maybe we'll get into, but I think that's probably a good one to start with.
Definitely. Daniel, you would you have a similar starting point story, or even, I don't know, I know you have,
okay. I can give you you know, my way to architecture was not by apprenticing myself to builders and not by going onto sites and studying, you know, construction methods. My way to architecture, and which still is purely through drawing. Just through drawing. And I, by the way, didn't draw architecture in my life. I always, you know, when I was in school, and I was at a very good school, and I don't know how they let me graduate, I never designed a single building. Because I said to my professors, very, very good ones, you know, how can I design a building if there's no budget, there's no civic society, you know, design a school, design a library, you know, it's kind of a waste of time. So I did everything possible to use my drawings to kind of construct a treatise on possibilities of architecture which are immune so far to all those conditions that make architecture possible. Now to fast forward, my first building, I won a competition for the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I presented a project, and the Senate of Berlin called me one day. And I was sitting with, by the way, I'd never designed a building before. Not even a small one. I never drew a plan, a section, an elevation of any building. So I was asked by the Senate of Berlin to come, and there was a bunch of technical experts and builders of Berlin, maybe 30, 40 people. And I saw my drawings on the walls, and then the man who was in charge of the situation said to me, Mr. Libeskind, you see, and they saw the building is a zigzagging building, it's complex. And he put a piece of paper and he said, here is a pen, tell me, show me how the basement is constructed. So I knew this was like the ultimate test. So I took the pen and I drew a perfect rectangle. And I saw the relief. And everybody said, this man knows architecture. He's an expert. So yeah, that's the mythology, the ridiculous idea of what architecture really is, and how people create it also, and how people are, you know, sort of fooled by what is built as a condition of so-called reality. But that really taught me a lesson, that all you have to do is do 4 right angles, and you're a legitimate architect. That's all you have to do. And anybody can do it. It's easy.
Can I just tell you, there are no 4 straight angles in the entire building?
No, they're not. They're not. I don't think there are. I really don't. I think it was a systematic idea of mine, not to put a single right angle in that building. You know, because the word right, you know, are always together. Right and right.
Yeah. Can I take a step into our space a little bit? And I think, Sanford, you, it's funny because the way we reach to your work, embarrassing as it is to admit, I mean, I know your work very well, but the way we reached to that specific work was almost in a kind of a stupid search when we were like, oh, I think I saw this work by Sanford that has a star in it, and then it happened, and all these pictures, and you know, sometimes these things come together, but then when the conversation around the work started, it was obviously a very meaningful project to think about space in these terms. But I wonder if you don't mind introducing a bit that work and the body of work to which it comes from.
Sure. So the body of work which we're referring to is called the Codex series. And there's one example in the other room. There's basically a repurposed quilt. It has a big star in the center and other interventions done in, oh, there we go. So this This body of work started around 2007. I was invited to do an installation in Philadelphia for a project called Hidden Cities. And they invited several international artists there to reimagine formerly very well-populated, important buildings throughout Philadelphia that had now gone into disrepair or had been forgotten. So we were given access to these places to reimagine them and do these installations. So I went down to Philly to do some research, and I thought I was going to really engage with the Masonic Temple and stained glass, and I was going to all these sites. But strangely enough, I ended up in these little sidebar tiny galleries and exhibitions that happened to be about quilts. And the last place I visited that day was the Mother Bethel Church, which is the oldest Black-owned piece of real estate in the US, reportedly. And it's also one of the hubs on the Underground Railroad. And in Philadelphia, there are several documented hubs of the Underground Railroad. And in their basement, they also had an exhibition of quilts. And I started to look at the color blocking and realized that the quilts were actually more full of tension and possibility and potential for me than the stained glass was, because of how it's been denigrated. Quilts have been denigrated, I think, in that dialogue between crafts, art, men's work, women's work, all those, binaries that don't really serve the work any purpose. I thought there was a lot of tension and interest in that. So I borrowed all these quilts because I could not buy any of these quilts. And I placed them throughout the church and really sort of had them in relationship to the stained glass, but it started to create its own dialogue. So a few months later, all the work had gone back to its owners. I was able to keep one quilt, and I took it to my studio and I started painting on it. And I had a group of collectors that came through the studio, and as they were all leaving, one woman stayed behind and said that she had been collecting quilts for years. And she didn't know what to do with them. They were becoming moth-ridden in her closet. And then she also dropped that she was a descendant of Andrew Jackson and had quilts going all the way back to that era. And she says, I really like what you're doing. I like that you come from a graffiti background on some level and that this is Americana, so there's a deep political thing happening here. And I was like, but these are just found objects. This is more postmodern. This is Duchamp, So we had this, back and forth of evading and, proposing what these could be about. And she's like, I would love to give you some if you'd be open to it. And she gave me 30 quilts, and that started the whole series. So up to this point, I've probably done over 100, but I did have a traveling exhibition called Code Switch that started at the Bronx Museum. Then it went to the CAM in Los Angeles, California African American Museum on USC's campus. And then it went to the Speed Museum. And there is a Yale-published monogram that has all of the pieces from that show. And that's sort of where it happened. But for me, these encapsulate so many, many things. There's the aesthetic sensibilities. There is the ready-made quality of it. I also lived in Japan for 3 years, which I think we'll get into at some point. But while I was there, I got into, I became very interested in wabi-sabi and the notion of the only real perfection is imperfection. So if I got a quilt that was in disrepair, I could repair it and then make a new work out of it. I'm also still doing graffiti. These are sort of autobiographical for me as a person, but end up being a more archetypal autobiographical works about the US. So all these things were happening in that work. So after I did the Codex show, literally I thought I was going to stop because I had done so many. But even now, to this day, there are things that speak to me in all these quilts. Part of their own history, part of nostalgia, part of the aesthetics, part of all the things that they potentially can be. So it still continues.
And do you find that many of these include a symbolism inside them? Do you even trace that symbolism? Do you refer to it in your edition and your work on top of it?
A little bit of all of that. And I think one thing we're sort of alluding to is that there has been rumored history that quilts served a purpose along the Underground Railroad routes as escaping enslaved people would try to escape to the north. So if a quilt of a certain pattern was hung on outside of a house, or if it was hung in a certain fashion, it gave coded information. I became interested in that as a part of vernacular history and thought of myself as a cross-generational contributor to those quilts. And for all the quilts I use, I should mention they're all pre-1900. It's very important to me that they're very old because it does become a dialogue with the past in order to make work to resonate in the future. So in some ways, I look at these as like relics or ruins for future historiography, basically. so that people in the future could figure out what was going on between 2026 and 1889 when the original quilt was made.
And I heard you say in a talk that you mentioned, my acts can be understood as defacement or beautification. Do you find sometimes that you bear some kind of is the act of working on these something that's, are you feeling like you're often possibly destroying something? Is that a...
It's a negotiation. I spend time with each quilt. It's not like I go, find a quilt and have one idea and I just execute. As you can see, even in the examples we're showing, I'm doing many different things with each one. And still to this day, I'm finding new things to do. I use them structurally, I use them sculpturally, I use them graphically, I use them painterly. So there's a poetry inside of each one. So in some way, I become a quilt whisperer in a way. And even in the making of any given work, it is a push and pull. There is a moment when I think I'm doing something very beautiful, and then I have to stop myself because it's too beautiful. We have to go in another way because now I'm aestheticizing. Now I'm not letting the quilt talk to me. So it's a back and forth.
Thinking of this notion exactly of, of defacement versus beautification and so on, I wonder, Daniel, if you would walk us through a little bit sort of your very, I think many people would be interested in hearing your very unusual decision to work with Ground Zero by way of, what I would call almost like a negative form or a form of retraction or subtraction from the ground, which could be seen as a kind of a metaphoric gesture, but I think there's more to it. And yeah.
Well, let me connect with what Sanford just said. Cities are always asleep under a quilt. The structure of a city is a quilt. They call it a grid, a pattern of development, a pattern of how a city is organized. But if you really look at the origin of that quilted pattern, is to make us forget the origins of the city. Because cities originated, basically, the cities that we know, with the right angle, the right way to do things, from military. It was a military operation that created that system of order that we now live in and accept as a sense of freedom. And I've always wondered, when you look at the buildings in New York, you look at all the little cubicles, everything in this, and look down, it's also divided. It's amazing that people consider this really the freedom, that we have such incredible freedom. But when you look at everything, it's been parceled out, and we are under the quilt, deeply asleep. And so I identify... So I really identified with what you're doing, because the quilt hides stars, it hides all sorts of things. And probably the most difficult thing to do in the world is to change the geometry of a street. You can change buildings, you can create icons, you can create new parks, but try to change a street anywhere in the world. Now, Berlin is a very good example. Berlin was destroyed. Completely bombed in carpet bombing. Dresden, where I've also worked, carpet bombing. But the one thing that has not been destroyed, it cannot be destroyed, is the street. At the end, the street dominates. Even in the ruins of Berlin, of Dresden, the resurrection comes via that pattern. So when you speak about Ground Zero, I did not start with the obvious connection of the grid, bring the streets back, before, what happened before the Twin Towers were built. That was almost everybody else did that. But I thought, this is a chance not to do that, to show the absence of that sense, and also, in a way, to attain some freedom for the city by creating public space that is not quilted in that pattern and is not limited by the pattern. Of course, the center of the scheme is really on the memorial, which is the footprints of the building, which I thought was very important, because you really get the dimension of the city structure through that, and the water, which was also part of my idea, to bring something that undermines that severity with a natural sense of acoustics, not, sort of try to to resolve the noise of the city through the waterfalls, and it works. If you are at ground zero, you hardly hear the myriad of ambulances and police cars and traffic and noises. You really have a different experience. So part of my design is acoustical. It's not what you see visually, it's the ear. As you enter the site, the entire acoustics of the space changes. And of course, there are many other aspects, if that's what you're asking. You have 10 million square feet of density on the site. 10 million square feet of density is a downtown of a major American city. Just think about it. We don't think about it. It's like the downtown of Denver, downtown of Baltimore, downtown of a big American city, and it's all reduced to just a few buildings, because the building size is so immense that we don't even realize that the second tower at ground zero, which is about to be constructed, is still much bigger than the Empire State Building. And that's tower number 2. That's not tower number 1. So it's hard to understand the volumetrics and density of that site. And my job here was, how do you decrease the oppression of building, of light? How do you bring as much light as possible to the memorial? How do you create the best possible sense for people to walk on the streets? So, most people concentrate on the aesthetics of buildings, but that was definitely not my interest. I had to represent it in my renderings, but I'm a master planner. I'm not really designing each of the buildings. What I'm designing is a neighborhood. And what is the neighborhood like, in the afternoon in winter? What are the conditions? What is the wind? What is the light in the memorial? Those are the basic need, and that's why I said about the street. A lot of my time was spent on things that nobody will ever see or appreciate. Arguing with city authorities to make a street 6 inches wider. Now, that's not a battle that's gonna get you onto a front page of Art in America. Get 6, but it's important for people. Make the street a little bit wider so it's a little more comfortable to walk. So those are the battles. Those are the sort of true battles to how to create a sense of space in that site that is meaningful to people and that works for people who are not in those buildings. And by the way, I always thought of my parents. My parents were workers. My mother worked in a sweatshop in really horrible conditions, I have to say. I was there once. My father worked in a tiny little place, rat-infested, which was a printing shop, small print on Stone Street. I thought to myself, if my parents were alive, what would they get from ground zero? They would never be in the lobby of building number 1, building number 2. But where would they be? They'd be in the subways, in the trains, on the streets. What do they get from this scheme? Which is what most New Yorkers, they're not going to be in those towers. What do they get? They would have to get a sense of space that is in some way inspiring, a view, a sense that New York is a beautiful city, that the horrors that befell New York are not the last word about New York, that there is hope, that is something interesting, and that running to feed your kids can become something different than just, one more limited public space that is driven basically by capital, just by money. That's why the streets, that's the whole argument. How do you an architect doesn't determine the program of a building. The program is determined by authorities, by capital, by politics. And so how do you deal with that in designing a project?
That was exactly, I was about to ask you, did you find a lot of resistance?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, I really consider, if I think about ground zero, I think of the Odyssey, Homer. No, really, because, it took him 10 years to get back home, right? And in the meantime, he was stuck, with islands, with drugs, with addiction, with sex, with exploitation, with pigs, with men turning into monsters, right? That's what I experienced. Really, it wasn't any different. But, I'm happy that I got back home. After such a trip, because sometimes you don't survive that trip. But the resistance comes from all sides. It's not a resistance of just some capitalist, and it's not a resistance of some advocates for, Trump's idea rebuilt, the two towers as they were. It's a resistance from all sides. And to navigate and to, it's like what you do in a different scale, in a different world, but somehow find a balance. How can you change what seems to be such an irresistible system? And many creative architects try to change it by not building. They think they win because they make a lot of drawings, and they get out of it by an illusion that they won through utopian operations. Others just sell their soul, which is very profitable. But I didn't do either.
But to speak, okay, so if we're there are, when I was looking at the works and the projects we examined towards this conversation, Sanford, there were two works of yours that I thought were really talking about this ephemerality of a structure that's only the groundwork of a structure, maybe. And one of these was the mandala of the and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right, is the Bodhisattva. Yeah, and the other one was a prayer rug you've done in 2005, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind introducing these two projects.
Sure. Well, this is very akin to what you're speaking about. When I was coming out of graduate school, I went into graduate school at the Art Institute of Chicago to study painting. When I got there, I never did a single painting. There was no canvas, there was no paint at all. I did all video, performance, sound, and sculpture. And when I got deeper into sculpture, I wanted to just get rid of the pedestal altogether. Why do these things sit on the plinth, which defines them? That's just like a work being in a white cube, which defines it. These are frames, these are things they sort of push against, basically. So I got really interested in more installation art, more performance and happenings and so on. So one of the first pieces I did upon graduating, when I moved to New York City, in fact, I was invited to do the residency at PS1 and at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And I did this specific project for PS1 where I made these hand-cut dance floors made out of surplus rubber that I would get from the bus company because they used to use it for the bus floors. And I would get the surplus pieces and then cut them literally by hand, to make these large dance floors. I made a few small ones in Chicago, but when I got to New York, I made this one, which is around 16 by 16 feet, I think. And I pieced it together, but the idea was that this was going to be used for a performance. And then after the performance, the piece would then be exhibited as an artifact. And it would be up to the viewer to sort of figure out, piece together what actually happened there. And for me, this was a way of actually introducing part of that hip hop culture, once again, going back to my childhood, into the institutions in a way that was a little bit more subversive. And by that, I mean, when I would put these in a museum after the fact, I would invite breakdancers to come and initiate the piece, which of course the museums love because now they're getting a larger demographic in their, in their space. And I did not pay the dancers. I didn't tell them they had to dance. I just invited them to the opening. If they wanted to, they could. So there was no pressure on them. But in fact, a lot of times they did. And this was a reason I did this to animate the piece, because if you were to see one of these on the floor, of course, there's a riff off of, Carl Andre and post-minimalism and all of that. But you also see these scuff marks on there, which allows you to walk on it. But you wonder where those scuff marks come from. And they were all mostly circular. And the only marks that make that are breakdancers making circular dance, rubbing their shoes in different angles on the floor. So usually when I would exhibit one of these, what you're seeing on the left, is an actual video of the performance. It's a still image from the performance. This was at the Bronx Community College. The artwork went there first before it was slated for any kind of museum or institution at all. It was for the streets. So, all ages, all races, everybody was there. It was a big deal. It was a breakdance competition called the Battle of the Boroughs. And afterwards, I edited a video that I would usually show in an exhibition space on a very tiny monitor. You actually had to walk up to the wall and look at this tiny thing to see the overhead projection of the dancers. Meanwhile, the floor is gargantuan near you, but it's totally quiet, nothing on it. So you have to sort of piece together what had happened there. It was a way of dealing sort of, I think, with the idea of encyclopedic museums and how they talk about cultures in the past, and they usually show a video of something happening and an object on a pedestal in, a vitrine. I was like, there's no vitrines here. There's, an object that you might overlook. You might not know what it does until you get some clues from the video. And if the video's not there and there's dancers, then you obviously know what to do. And as these pieces started to travel around the world, I would always make sure there were certain hours per week where anybody can come off the street and dance. So you could do bachata, you could do tango, you could do breakdancing, whatever you did, because it had to accumulate the scuff marks to be a true ethnographic object. So, I was basically dealing with all those different institutional and artistic languages to create this work. It also encapsulated my interest in music.
Yeah, but it's funny because this is a very, the next work I wanted to show, which was the prayer rug, is working on an almost opposite principle, because they're both kind of vacating space in a museum and in a place that's usually not occupied by the art. But one of them is really you're constantly inviting people to interrupt, and in a way, I didn't know that people were that the framework of the dances were so loose. And actually, it's interesting because I think for museums that's sometimes actually a hard thing to digest.
They hated all that.
Yeah. Speaking of resistance. Yeah.
But again, the pieces started at breakdance competitions. And then only after, they had to be danced on first to even go to the museum. If I were to show it as a pristine floor, it wouldn't have had the impact that I wanted. But yes, on the opposite spectrum of that, there were these pieces, and this is all colored sand poured directly on the floor. There's no adhesives, it's not affixed. If you sneeze, it's gone. And this is around 20 feet by 40 feet, and it took around, I'd say, 300 to 400 hours of literally sifting sand on my knees. I had a team of 5 people that I trained, but yes, we did that. And interesting thing, this was at Triple Candy that used to be in Harlem many years ago. At the opening, a friend of mine came with their daughter, and there were around 200 people standing around, hanging out, and the girl got freaked out, and she ran across the floor to get to her mother. But, she was so fast and so light that there was just a little tiny bit of a smudge on a bit of the sand. But what I realized at that point was that most of the people in that room thought that this was paint. They didn't realize that it was literally painstakingly, meticulously placed sand grains. And when that happened, there was a gasp in the room. Everyone was like, but I already took the pictures, so I was good. I knew that had to happen. But again, this goes back to my time, the 3 years I spent in Japan and studying Buddhism and this idea of ephemerality. And yes, it was me being contrarian to sort of, I guess, the consumer, the side of the art world at that time. Not making an object that could be held or taken or collected or, obsessed over in that way, but a memory that got better with each retelling.
But I found it also, I had to ask you about the placement you chose for the work and how you positioned it inside the columns in that space. I don't know if you could say anything about that decision.
This, and you'll see this in all of my work, I always have to resist an impulse to overly aestheticize. It comes very naturally for me. So sometimes I make decisions based off of the space itself or the purpose of the show or what kind of the crowds that may come, or if there are no crowds. I play to those things. Those are cues that I work with. And for this, I needed it to point directly at Mecca. And to do that, I had to go off the axis of the space. So that's why you see the intervention of those columns. I could have trimmed it down and done all these other things, but again, to make it a little bit more responsive and site-specific, the inclusion of that was very important.
I guess both of these things made me think and very much about the notion of monuments. And I think this is something that seems to be kind of underlying both of your practices. There's a lot of talk about historical events and pasts and memory within the work, but also a very strong kind of attitude towards temporality, which I find fascinating. So, not least because I'm married to a person who researches monuments for the last 10 years, I kind of went back and asked, so how does one define a monument today, which is kind of such a difficult question. We define monuments over history. Monuments have largely been defined as these kind of permanent edifices that are to be there and to commemorate something with a very coherent narrative that, as we now know, can change within a period of less than a generation. So one particular one particular definition that I think continues to sort of hold, or at least I'm told, is one of the stronger definitions. I think it's really interesting to put forward is Alois Riegel, who was an art historian, but was really fascinated by monuments. And if it's okay, I'll just read his definition of the term. He said, in its oldest and most original sense, a monument is a work of man erected for the specific purpose of keeping particular human deeds or destinies, and in parentheses he writes, or a complex accumulation thereof, alive and present in the consciousness of future generations. So that's a very kind of classic, traditional, long-term idea of the monument. But I think both of you, as monument makers, I would love to hear if you had any kind of, working definition or a way you approach when you do a work, or when you build, you work with a space that needs to occupy that function of commemoration.
I think you cannot think when you're designing so-called monument that you're making a monument. That would be a monumental mistake. What you're trying to do is to transmit, and I think Riegel is correct, something that is important, something that has not an informational value, but a spiritual value to a generation that has no connection to it. You mentioned Duchamp, but Duchamp said that in 30 years, all the art in the museum created is just in a cemetery, because nobody can understand what those things are. So let's say there's a Duchamp show now in New York. He would say, you don't get a single thing from this show because it's all dead. The people who did it and the people who understood it are dead. And so you're in a cemetery, in a monumental cemetery, which you can also say a museum by definition is. But to create a so-called monument, to transmit something which is not material, but spiritual, you need to communicate in some way. And now there are different ways of communicating, in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions, in mystical ways, which every monument has to have also, a communication which is not obvious at all. I'll give you an example. In my monument, it's called Monument of Names in Amsterdam, which is 104, I think, 1,000 names of Jews and also some 3,000 Roma and Sinti who were deported from Holland and murdered. I put every name, first name, last name, and age, at death, and where. So I didn't put when they were born, it just died at age of 7, died at 82, murdered at 82, murdered at 3. That's kind of obvious, bricks, because that's the material of Amsterdam. Everything is made of bricks. And the monument is in a center of Amsterdam where the Jews lived. No Jews live there anymore, but they lived in those brick houses. But then I put something completely that had nothing to do with it, which were 4 Hebrew letters, which really spell the word in Hebrew, in memory, which shine upwards. Nobody can read those letters. They're not readable. They are stainless steel, very large scale stainless steel. They shine the light upwards, and you don't see where the light is, but you see the mirror impact. When you look at the bricks, there's mirrors around you that reflect the houses on the other side of the street, the trees. In a way, you cannot really see this as something of the past, because you're always assaulted by the kind of prose of the present. You're always seeing something unexpectedly of the present, which is on top of the bricks. And, well, what kind of communication? Who is showing those letters? To whom are those letters being shown? Where is the light of those letters shining to? That was kind of what I was interested in, not in what is the informational value. And by the way the walls of brick follow the letters also in a kind of labyrinth. And Hebrew letters are really perfect to do that, because Hebrew letters, and that's why I love Hebrew letters, not because I'm Jewish, but because they are just the most beautiful forms. The Hebrew letters and the way they are written, And the fact that they've been written like that for thousands of years, and if you write, a scroll and make a mistake, you've got to throw the whole scroll out because it's invalid by, liturgical laws because you've made a mistake in how the letter was shaped. So that's why Hebrew still can be read, as you know. But I love the fact that the Hebrew letters are not like, Roman letters or any other letters, because they don't just communicate what they say. They are the symbolism is part of the way the letter looks and what it is. I don't know whether I explained it. It's kind of fascinating. Even if you don't know any Hebrew, you look at a Hebrew word, like even a short word like El or something, and you see that there's some very strange communication through that symbol. So anyway, I use those letters in that way, actually. And you say, what is the monument? Yeah, I would say the following. You cannot have I've always thought about this. A lot of people would like to make architecture into a butterfly. Like glowing, beautiful, delicate butterfly that it's so poetic, but I think it's more like an elephant. Because, you can get the elephant dressed. In circus, they get it dressed in different things. Remember, you can ride on top of an elephant, like make a picture on top. But you cannot alter the elephant. The elephant, you can make him look cute. You can make the elephant look like cuddly, cuddly toy. But it's like architecture. There's something about just the sheer weight of the elephant and the fact that you can't alter the elephant and that the elephant cannot disappear. You can only kill the elephant, but not like butterfly, cannot just elide and vanish into sort of a beautiful light. So I always decide this about monuments and about architecture itself. Those who create architecture like the butterfly architect, whose work I'm totally uninterested in, the light and this and clouds and nice curves and stuff like that, and the elephant architects that have the memory of the elephant, which is severe. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about the elephant memory.
Just before I turn the question to you, Sanford, it's interesting because you mentioned that history of the Hebrew language and so on. The biblical terminology for a monument was a hand and a name, Yad Vashem, and a hand meant an erect structure that emerged, and a name meant the act of naming, of pointing to a certain. That was the act of a name is an act of commemoration. So it's an interesting link.
Yeah, especially when the hand is cut off and the name is transformed or changed.
Yeah, precisely. This is why it's such a. But this is why this medium is so difficult for us today, because language moves quickly. Ideology is at stake, or is really changing.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I don't like reading on a Kindle. I have a lot of books because I travel a lot, so I have a lot of books but I dislike reading, even though it's very comfortable in a dark airplane I prefer a book, because a book you can really remember. It has a weight, it has a place in the world, but the virtual text, which is so light, is somewhere where you cannot really access it with your hand. And I think people who are reading on the Kindle will lose connection to books, even if they read 1 million books, because they won't be able to find the book somehow. It's strange because it's about a physical object. If you get rid of the physical object, look, I've seen poets reciting their poems with their own book of poetry on the table, their hand on the poem, but I don't think they could do it if the book wasn't there. They wouldn't be able to recite it if they didn't have you maybe had that experience, right? Yeah. So yeah, there's something to be said that monument is a material reality, and you cannot make a virtual a virtual monument can be easily erased by a mouse, right? A virtual monument is erasable, and that's the Venturi drawing. Remember, Robert Venturi made that famous drawing in Las Vegas of this stupid building, and then a sign on top of it: "I'm a monument." I don't know whether he said it or whether I just invented it, but I think it's there. Yeah. So you see, it was already apparent way back before the technology was there.
Sanford, your thoughts? Yeah.
I'm really still trying to figure it out. Part of me, as you can tell by these works, was bucking that idea that anything could have a sense of permanence at all. And at best, what I'm trying to do is search for an erratic nature of an object or an experience. Something that a person will take with them that goes beyond the visual and maybe even tangible, but goes more into the cellular and visceral, where they talk about it, and once again, years later, they tell the story, it changes, but it's still working somehow in their mind. There was a big stat that used to go around in grad school saying that the average viewer looks at an object for 3 seconds or something like that, probably even less now. So is it really the visual experience, or is it something that is more erratic, more psychological, more metaphysical that happens when looking at an object or an experience? And the reason I say I'm still figuring that out is because I do make objects. Yeah. But when I make an object that I know is living in objecthood, I think there's different stakes there versus something that has to go beyond that. And at best, the objects can do that. I think that's why I sometimes refer to history itself as a material. Found objects, quilts, they have a history. I can make a quilt piece that doesn't have a body in it, yet it's figurative because we all know what quilts do and their relationship to the body. There is a sense of belonging to a quilt. Everyone sees a quilt, they feel a connection to it because they all have one. Or they want to get rid of one, but they don't want to throw it away. So they end up on my doorstep because I transform them. But it is because there is something about that, and it goes to that tangible, just like the book. There is an investment there. There's the weight, there's the reading, there's the rhythm of the hands, there's the speed of what you read, there's telling someone else about it, the dog-eared corners, giving it to somebody else. There's a lot of interaction that does not exist in the digital. I feel the same way about objects. That's why I've always been drawn to found objects and used objects, because they come with that history, that erratic nature that goes beyond the objecthood of the piece itself.
Can I ask you then about a specific work that made me think about this? I don't know if we can see the Blossom piece, because I heard you talk about this work, and maybe it's better that you tell the story, but I felt like so for example, if you tell that story, but I'm also curious to hear whether you think that this was made in your mind as a monument to a certain, or if that term applies to this work, for example.
I would tell myself this is a monument, but I wouldn't necessarily advertise to others that this was a monument for a specific thing. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you more background. This piece is called Blossom. Once again, 3 years in Japan, studying Buddhism, so on. Blossom, full of potential. We all know the blossom, a lotus blossom, for example, is in a riverbed in the muck and the mire until it blossoms and it's this beautiful thing. But this specific piece was inspired by the Gina 6 incidents that happened in Gina, Louisiana in 2007 or 2008, where there was a fairly integrated high school in that town, and there was a big tree where all the white kids would sit, and it was like the popular kids' tree. And one day a black student wanted to sit there and asked an instructor if they could sit there, and the instructor was like, of course, go sit under the tree, why are you even asking? So the kid goes and sits under the tree. Gradually, some of the white kids start to leave. The next day, everyone comes back to school, and now there's nooses hanging from the tree. So this is 2007, 2008. I was a professor. I was teaching at Columbia at the time. A week later, there were nooses hanging off of some of the black professors' doors here in New York City, in Manhattan. So this was all very contemporary activities happening. So what happened with the Gina 6 thing, these white kids leave, there's a noose, and then that started like a years-long battle between the different groups at this school, which culminated one day at a corner store where a group of white kids were inside the store, a group of black kids were coming up, they get outside, they have a confrontation. The white kid pulls out a gun, the black kids take the gun, beat the kids up, then the black kids get arrested for stealing the gun. Yeah, exactly. Sounds like a joke, but this happened, right? This is 2007, 2008. And then, of course, there were protests and everybody came to town and so on. So in my mind, this became a monument to that. But I talk about it in terms of the potential to go beyond that. We all know that the Buddha also finds enlightenment underneath a tree. This is where the tree is the axis mundi. It connects the heavens to the earth and below. It oversees everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So metaphorically, that's how that was working. But the piano that is attached to it is playing my own rendition of the song Strange Fruit, which was, of course, written by Billie Holiday and Abe Meerpool, which alone is an interesting story right here in Harlem, blah, blah, blah. But when you walk in, the keys start moving, the pedals start moving, and it plays this sort of lamenting version, my version of Strange Fruit. And it commemorates the incident as well as commemorating the 400 years of those incidents happening in the US as the constant reminder that, oh, here in 2007, 2008, this is still happening. And in my mind, I said, okay, I'm not gonna do this all the time, but I might do it every decade or so when some poignant event happens, so that over time, these end up being sort of like, let's say, snapshots or testimonies to a moment that we have not evolved beyond. And it's even encapsulated in my language when speaking about certain work. I don't talk about race that much, but I do talk about archetypes. And I think there are archetypes within human condition. Once again, one is that auratic thing, the tangible experience. We all experience that. We all forget, and then we all are rudely awakened and remember this. And we realize that this is part of the human condition, that this thing is a cyclical thing, whether you like it or not, and how do you position yourself in that? So in my mind, this is a monument to that, but I don't talk about it normally as a monument like that. I want people to come and experience it on their own. So they walk up to this, they hear the sound, they walk around, they start to infer a few things. There's this huge tree, and then of course there's the piano stool that is kicked over as if somebody were strung up by a noose and they kicked the stand right underneath the person so that they fell and died. So it's a bit morbid, but it's also a really nice piece. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's in the Brooklyn Museum.
Do you mind if we play just 20 seconds or 30 seconds from... It does bring the question of music, which I think is, you know, we talk about space today, but I think somehow music feels very, very relevant and very relevant to both of your formations and your practices. Daniel, you started your, in a way, your life as a musician rather than aspiring architect.
For sure.
Does that stay with you in your practice today?
No, I think I never gave up music. I just gave the instrument I was playing. Because the instrument I was playing, and it's an interesting story. I was a virtuoso on the accordion. Now everybody kind of laughs because accordion is associated with beggars, poor people, folk music. But I played it because my parents were too scared to bring I'm from Poland, post-war Poland. My parents were too afraid to bring a piano because of our neighbors. You look, the Jews are bringing it. No, we're gonna bring a piano in a suitcase, a hidden piano. So, and what did I know? I got to play with keys and buttons and so on, and I became a virtuoso. In fact, when I came to Israel, somebody said, you know, who heard me play, you should compete in America-Israel competition for music. So I did, and you know, when I went to the competition, there were hundreds of kids. Every Jewish child in Israel was a genius in music. So, you know, on flute, on voice, on cello, on violin, you know, trombone, harmonic, whatever. And I remember my father, this really stays with me. My father had to bring the accordion because it's heavy. I couldn't carry it. And there were three people in the jury. Little did I know who they were, but they were Mrs. Kusevitsky, which was the wife of Sarge Kusevitsky, who was founder of really music in Boston and in America. Zino Francescatti, one of the great violin virtuosos, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and Isaac Stern, head of the jury. So when I came in, they looked at me like, this man is, this boy is in the wrong room. This is a competition for serious music. But when I strapped the accordion and my father left, and I played 4 chords of the toccata in D minor, and their attention suddenly changed because I played only classical music. I did play some pieces like Rimsky-Korsakov and stuff like that for the impact. And I made a lot of money, by the way, much more money, as my wife says, than as an architect. Much more money as a. Anyway, I was one of the winners of the competition, together with Itzhak Perlman. There were only 5 winners. And Isaac Stern complained to me later on, and many years later I met him. He said, like, you were the only one we gave the prize who did not become famous in music. But it was because of him, actually. It was his fault, because he put his arm around me and said, you've got to give up this instrument. You've got to play the piano. And, I love the instrument because it was beautiful. The instrument is beautiful. It was a red Italian accordion. It was set with all the registers. And he undermined my, because he thought the instrument was not good. So, I drifted away. I still played in concerts, and I, played in venues and Town Hall in New York and in many venues. But he undermined and then I changed my instrument. I said, I've got to change the instrument. I wound up changing it to architecture. But it wasn't my original idea. It was just, I got stuck in architecture. It was just, it could have been another instrument. It was by chance, actually, really by chance. So music is very close to my heart. I never gave it up. Every building that I make, every drawing that I make is an architectural score. And I think music and architecture have the following relationship in my mind. Music and architecture don't have any message. If you play a piece of music, a Beethoven sonata or a rap song, there's beyond anything that it says, there is no point. There's no message to it. Maybe rap is a bad example. Maybe rap does give you a message. That's why I don't like it as much. But in music, really, the music that I love doesn't give you a message. Even folk music doesn't give you any message. It just ends before it gives you a message. And it's like, what is the message of a quintet of Brahms? What is the message of the 5th Symphony of Beethoven, or the Jupiter Symphony, or a trio sonata? It's no message. You think as you're following the music, you're in it deeply, and then at the end, just evades what was it about. Just like architecture. It doesn't, the bad architecture of the dictators always has a message. It has a message, very clear message. So you look, I use music all the time. And architectural plan is a score. It's got numbers, it's got dots, it's got measurements, it looks just like a musical score, in fact. I had a composer, Aurelio de la Vega, a very famous Venezuelan composer, who looked at my drawing and says, oh, I can play them. You don't need to build them, I can play them. So yeah, you can play. And there was a performance of my drawings in Berlin not long ago by an orchestra, they took the drawings and they played them. They created their own composition, which I loved. Maybe they recorded it. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there is no difference between music and architecture. And I think this is already clear in Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer said that these are the 2 extremes, architecture and music. Architecture is like enslaved music because it's so heavy, and music is a false architecture because it has no weight. That's beautiful. I mean, that's really true, isn't it? That's kind of true. They're opposites. So yeah, it makes one think a lot about how we define music, how we define architecture. Where do you find the music? And I think Goethe's paraphrase of Schlegel, that the architecture is frozen music, has a little bit of this idea that there's something mystical in architecture, that you feel something. But I think he was wrong. I think Goethe was completely wrong, because I think the musical aspect of architecture is not in the frozen aspect, it's in the acoustical aspect. It's how a space sounds. And by the way, when I designed the Jewish Museum in Berlin, I kid you not, I made a model, a hollow model, and I played it, like to change some proportions in the building, because when you even hit a piece of paper, you can hear the difference of sound. And I did incorporate Schoenberg's structure, the 60 unit theme from Moses and Aaron into the void of the Jewish Museum. It's not very obvious. You have to be a scholar to decipher it. And some scholars have deciphered it. But I really was interested in how can you complete an opera that was not completed. Because I love Moses and Aaron. It's really one of the seldom performed operas because it needs a huge cast, and it's Schoenberg. And there's, everybody thinks, oh, Schoenberg, it's so heavy, it's so German, it's, so Jewish. But it's really a great, great opera, and he gave it up. After the second act, he said, I can't finish it anymore. And it ends with this aporia of Moses, and nothing happens. And he gives up music and leaves Berlin. He's exiled. But I thought, I could complete it. And I listen to it very often if you ever are in the Jewish Museum and listen to the footsteps of the visitors across the void, you hear the third act of the answer that God gave to Moses. You can't find it in Schoenberg. You can find it in Berlin.
I love that. I love that.
I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask one last question, and if I could get a very short, but I am really curious to hear both of your thoughts about this, because as today's conversation shows, and this is really something that maybe I was hoping will pull us back to Joe Ray as well. One of the things we see in these space and these nebula paintings and in Joe's work is that he's consistently insistent on not pointing at specific events, although he does eventually do this. And some of the paintings and the nebula paintings we see, for example, in the exhibition are titled after the name of people who he finds had real struggles with the creation, with the establishing of their own personal space during the civil rights, struggles all throughout the last century. And a lot of these are actually named after people in this sense. And I guess that's exactly where he likes to collide the personal with the kind of universal argument. And I wonder, do you feel when you create a sense of political responsibility, or do you create entirely out of a place of expression and self-expression? But do you, because both of you are also very visible creators today, and I wonder if you assume some of that accountability, some of that responsibility as makers?
For me, I do believe some works I've made can be considered political, but they're, or even that Blossom piece, for me, it was a response to something, but I also don't include a didactic giving that whole story, typically. I think what's interesting to me is that it does have the potential to trigger thoughts and associations and references and interest to make people learn more. Beyond that, I wouldn't say for another artist that there is a responsibility to do that. In fact, I think right now, there might be even less of a responsibility, because that sometimes ends up being its own trap, that the work can only be seen through that lens, and everyone expects to see it through that lens and don't often see it outside of that. The only way that really changes is for when marginalized artists do exert the freedom to work however they want to work. That was the whole purpose of freestyle and the F shows at Studio Museum in Harlem, and the notion of post-black and so on. So for myself personally, I consider myself to work in different series, and I use the word tone a lot. Back to music. I think for me, my desire is to have my artworks over the year, the large, bird's eye view perspective of it, is that you see different tonalities in different series, in different individual works. So it's not just one note. It's several different notes. There's cacophony, there's catharsis, there's all this other stuff happening. So sometimes I make a series that really hits something on the head. I made a series of works called the BAM series, where I was taking African objects, sculptures and figures, and dipping them in wax and taking them to a shooting range and literally sculpting them with different caliber ballistics. So my tool were guns. And I did this at the same time when on everyone's a cell phone, you're seeing the murder of a different black person by the cops every couple of days. I, interestingly enough, was living in Berlin when that phenomenon really started to take off. And I felt detached from it because I was over there, but I was constantly reminded every morning when I see it on my phone. So that project was initiated by that. But of course, afterwards, I'm thinking of these objects as inkisi, or the African objects you might see at the Encyclopedic Museum that have the nails and the shards in it that are used by a group of people to protect them and sometimes to ward off evil. If you pulled out the nails, you'd have those cavities left by the gun. So I'm seeing this literally in the trajectory of figurative sculpture, from wood to bronze. Now I work in marble. So really there is that type of trajectory, I think, in that body of work. But at the same time I'm working on that, I could work on a bunch of photographs that have nothing to do with anything. And it's really the point of having a viewer being able to see both of those works and say, this is a way more complicated story than just a didactic saying that this is triggered by one particular event and this is a response to it. It's actually a lot more interwoven and complex than that. And I think, once again, as an archetype, humans are that way. We are not one note.
You ask about responsibility. I don't think I'm designing for any living person. I'm not taking account of any living person when I'm designing. And you ask for a monument, they're called monuments to the dead. So you're designing for the dead. You're not designing for the living. And that might sound really strange that you're not designing for the living people, but you're not. You're designing it for an unknown stranger, somebody who doesn't belong there at all, who will open the door, or the door is open. I think, of course you have to be responsible because, we have clients, we have to deliver projects, on budget and on time. But when I think about it, you're not thinking of how is this woman or person, man, or whoever entered, what will they feel like? Will they like it? Will they think it's too big or too small? I never think like that. It's kind of really of no interest. Sorry.
In that very optimistic note, I want to say a huge thank you to both of you. Really. Thank you.